Hey everyone, Lori Spencer here. Welcome back to our History Book Club series, episode 5. We are doing a reading of the book by New York Times bestselling author Jerry Oppenheimer. It's RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and The Dark Side of the Dream. And I'm just reading like selected excerpts from this book because it's lengthy. I'm not going to read the whole book, just kind of pulling some things that are interesting, things that he might be questioned about in his Senate confirmation hearings about some very strange behavior. Not going to lie. So to kind of move things along, I'm skipping chapter 11. And if you're reading along with me and you have the hardcover edition, we're going to start this week on page 125. Bobby returned home to Hickory Hill, where his mother was preparing for the May 1972 annual charity pet show thrown by the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Foundation. The place was a madhouse, according to Ted Kennedy's top senatorial aide, Richard Burke, who had been enlisted to help prepare the homestead for the event. He recalled that the younger of the Kennedy children were in various states of undress, running amok. Ethel scurried about, screaming orders at the top of her lungs. The kids were either playing or fighting and screamed constantly. Hickory Hill, he concluded, was definitely a place to visit at your own risk. Regarding Bobby Jr., Burke observed that Ethel seemed to be exhausted. One day, Burke ran into RFK's namesake at the house, wearing only his jockey shorts and looking dazed and glassy-eyed, the signs of being stoned. Outside in the garden, Burke was using a hoe to clear some weeds when he heard Bobby's brother David screaming at him to stop what he was doing, to not clear the weeds, but rather to put a fence around them. Just then, Ethel's secretary approached Burke and said, "Oh, they stopped you, huh?" When he asked what the weeds were, she told him marijuana. They grow it all the time and smoke it. Burke was surprised, not so much about the smoking, he'd done his share in college, but the growing, because he said it was illegal. And even if Ethel's kids were out of control, this was a very public home for the Kennedys, with press and dignitaries coming in and out all the time. But if they didn't see the problem, I certainly wasn't going to raise it. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. wasn't the first member of the Klan to have the dishonor of having his or her face and name smeared across the cover of the premier supermarket tabloid of the time, the National Enquirer, then billing itself as having the largest circulation of any weekly paper in America. But he was among the youngest of the third generation to become checkout line tabloid fodder. A few months after Bobby was asked to leave his second high school, Palfrey, the second boarding school from which he was expelled in less than 3 years, mainly for using drugs, inquiring minds who had paid 20 cents a copy at the cash register to read about UFOs and celebrity misdeeds beheld the blaring headline, "RFK Jr. leaves home, says he will marry." The Enquirer noted that the school had confirmed that Bobby had been a student there, that he had left in May, and if he had successfully completed his courses last spring, he would now be a senior. The 17-year-old Kennedy scion's future wife, the story claimed, was his girlfriend, 16-year-old Kim Kelly, who was with him when he threw the ice cream in the Hyannisport cop's face, her Bonnie to his Clyde. According to the tabloid, Bobby had, quote, dropped out of school. There was no mention, presumably for legal reasons, that he was actually booted for drugs. The story went on to say he no longer lives with his family and he plans to marry. Miss Kelly was described as a blonde high school sophomore. Her mother, Peg Kelly, wife of bartender Frank Kelly, was quoted extensively. She described Bobby as being very, very independent and revealed that his mother, Ethel, had told him he must live by the rules of her house or else he would have to leave home until he sees things the way the family sees them. So Bobby stays away. She said she felt Bobby was sensitive, but she also knew he's all boy. We love Bobby. He may not be brilliant in school, but which Kennedys were. He's a smart kid just the same. At the Kelly home, near the Kennedy compound, Bobby kept a change of clothes, she claimed, and often spends the night in a spare bedroom off the kitchen. The Tabloid, which paid big bucks for stories, checkbook journalism was a way of life in the Lantana, Florida newsroom, went on to quote an anonymous neighbor of the Kennedys, who made Bobby sound like some sort of a derelict, asserting that he had been sleeping wherever someone would take him for the night. Bobby buzzes into my house to listen to records. He's a quiet kid, but he lives a weird life. He might be sitting on the post office steps at 6 a.m. with friends, and you might see him there at midnight. There, however, was no mention of young Bobby's current drug usage. The Enquirer's story, with its titillating tale of Kennedy young love, was picked up by the wire services and distributed to the mainstream press. The story, replete with photos of shaggy-haired, skinny Bobby in an oversized sports jacket and wearing a necktie, and Kim, looking a bit chubby and scruffy herself, along with a photo of the Kellys' modest family home, quoted Kim's father as saying he had telephoned Ethel Kennedy twice in 1971, telling her she needed to do something about her son's behavior. He related how Bobby had climbed into his daughter's bedroom window in the middle of the night, and another time he had been on the verge of having Bobby locked up, but I don't want to discuss that. He is very welcome at my home now. He asks my permission when he wants to stay. Kelly said he took on some fatherly responsibility with Bobby, since no one in the Kennedy family seemed to be doing anything to help him. I felt he needed some guidance, Kelly told the Tabloid. I asked him what he wanted to do with his life and about school. He quit school last May, Bobby told me. I should go back to school, but I don't know if I will. During the course of the reporting of the story, an Enquirer reporter claimed to have picked up Bobby and Kim, who were hitchhiking in Hyannis on their way to Hyannisport. When the reporter asked Bobby whether he intended to return to school, Bobby answered no. Then he glanced back at Kim and said, "We're getting married." Asked what they would live on, Bobby replied, "I've got a job." But the story noted that Bobby had a reputation for mischief, and he began joking that he was going to get a job in the garbage department. Kim's father said his daughter idolized Bobby, and that Bobby had told him that he wanted to marry her. But Frank Kelly felt they were too young, even though they're all wrapped up in each other. She thinks there's nobody else like him in the world. He said that he was aware there were some people who considered Bobby trash, with which he disagreed. Bobby's far from it, the father of the daughter's lover declared. He's very quiet. He's a sincere kid. Bobby's got a long life to live. He's a kid, one who has had more heartbreak than anybody should have to stand. Chapter 13, Palfrey Street. Even with all of its drug, racial, and feminist issues, the Palfrey School was like a Franciscan monastery compared with Bobby's next step on his precarious way to a high school diploma. Experimental and alternative in the extreme, Palfrey Street School, located on Palfrey Street in the mostly blue-collar Boston suburb of Watertown, was founded just 7 years before Bobby first set foot on the small neighborhood school grounds, wearing dirty, faded jeans, smelling like patchouli oil, and accompanied by 2 men in suits, recalled his classmate, John Kutera, then a senior in the class of 72. Even though Bobby hadn't finished his junior year at Pomfret before he was asked to leave, he was given credit for the turbulent partial school year he had spent there and entered Palfrey as a full-fledged senior. Ethel Skakel Kennedy had distanced herself even more from Bobby after he'd been booted from Pomfret School, and because of the difficult issues with Kim Kelly, from the ice cream in the cop's face episode to the embarrassing National Enquirer story. So, all arrangements for his admission to the Palfrey School were handled, of course, by Lem Billings. Of all the private schools in New England, Palfrey was virtually unknown. Billings had heard about it from another parent, a close Kennedy family confidant whose son had gone there. Adam Yarmolinsky had been a trusted advisor to Bobby's father and his uncles JFK and Ted Kennedy. When Yarmolinsky died of leukemia at age 77 in 2000, the Massachusetts senator said, "All of us who had the good fortune to know him admired the brilliance of his mind and dedication to improving the equality of life for all Americans." Yarmolinsky's son, Toby, had graduated from Palfrey about a year before Bobby arrived. But Yarmolinsky said in 2013 that he didn't know Bobby then. Billings thought the permissive world of Palfrey would be good for his troubled teenage charge, and believed if there was too much structure, Bobby would just blow up, according to the woman with whom he would board during his senior year. Moreover, Lem Billings felt certain that Palfrey offered the only possibility that Bobby might finish high school. Unlike Millbrook and Pomfret, Palfrey was a day school, so Bobby required housing and meals and daily oversight. Enter Joey Brody, a mother of 3, who would have him as a paying lodger in her family's sprawling yellow 1865 farmhouse, still a fixer-upper, in neighboring Cambridge during his time at Palfrey. When Bobby arrived, Brody was teaching French and then 6th grade in area public schools. But she became a virtual surrogate mother to him because, as she asserted years later, Ethel didn't even call Bobby on his birthday. She was never here. Lem Billings had found the Brody family through a mutual friend, Samuel Hutchison Beer, a highly respected Harvard University political scientist who, during JFK's presidency, was head of Americans for Democratic Action, an organization committed to liberal politics. Beer lived in the Brody's neighborhood, and he and Joey Brody's husband, John, a mathematician who had once taught at Harvard, were active together in local politics. In the late summer of 1971, Beer called Brody and asked him whether he would be willing to talk to his friend Lem Billings about the possibility of having Bobby stay in their home while he was going to the Palfrey Street school. The Brodys, who had young people as roomers in the past, were amenable and a bit starstruck at the time. Longtime liberal Democrats, they were becoming a small part of Kennedy family history by having RFK's namesake in their home for a school year. Age-wise, Joey Brody could have been more a big sister to Bobby than the mistress of the house because she was just 11 years older than he. She had gotten married at 19. They would develop a close bond during his stay. He had arrived at her welcoming and warm home with Lem Billings in early September for a meet and greet, but Bobby wanted to chat with her privately and had asked Billings to wait outside. Brody's first reaction was that Bobby, quote, looked like a bird with a broken wing. He was trembling and skinny and looked like a really sad, lonely kid who'd been through hell, and my heart just went out to him, she recalled. I use the term a bird with a broken wing, but more explicitly and less metaphorically, he just needed to be viewed as a human being, as a person, without the endless context of the Kennedy family. He had a frightened, fragile, vulnerable quality, but I didn't really see him as nihilistic. Brody had done some research on the impact of losing a parent on a boy like Bobby, and she came to the conclusion that she would have a case history living with her. Bobby was at the most vulnerable age from an identity formation perspective, she said. I kind of made sure that everybody in the family, that every friend who came to visit, simply viewed him as a person, not a Kennedy. And during the school year he stayed with the Brodys, there was very little discussion about his politically powerful and privileged family. She said, I never ever asked Bobby, and he didn't really talk about his parents much at all, she said. As far as I can remember, I don't believe he ever actually spent any time talking about his father. I felt he was always on edge. On just one memorable occasion, however, chatter focused on his emotionally and physically distant mother, whom Bobby described to Joey Brody as controlling, maintaining that she was on top of him for everything and anything he did. One evening, in the Brody's kitchen, Joey brought up the subject of her husband John's relationship with his own mother, who Joey told Bobby was a wonderful lady but irrational. And he looked at me with his piercing blue eyes and said, I can identify with that. My mother's totally irrational and totally controlling. But that's the only conversation about her that we ever had, that I can remember. Knowing about Bobby's turbulent history and dangerous recreational pursuits, she had rules for him to follow if he was going to live in her house. I told Bobby, I have 3 really important rules, recalled Brody. First of all, no drugs. There can be no drugs in this house. Secondly, you always must call if you're going to be late for dinner, because dinners are a big deal around here. And the third thing, I don't really care if you want to have a girl sleep here, but I want it to be the same person all the time, because I want my kids to grow up understanding that love is good with one person. It was a curious set of regulations, especially for a troubled boy like Bobby, who, despite Lem Billings's belief that he needed more freedom or he would blow up, actually required tighter controls, even though he was about to turn 18 in January, just 4 months from the date he took up residence. Joey Brody's rules were curious because, in her very liberal home, sex was permitted for Bobby, but only if it was monogamous. Not many households in America, even back in the early swinging 70s, were so openly permissive with their teenagers. And Joey Brody's strict no drugs rule had a caveat as well. As it turned out, smoking marijuana in the house was A-okay with her, because that wasn't a drug in my mind, and still isn't, she said in a 2013 interview. I didn't mind it because I did it in the 60s. I would not have been shocked and appalled if Bobby smoked, but it wasn't my favorite thing with him, given everything I knew about his drug use. Pot didn't freak me out at all, she said. She remembered that Bobby toked up in his room, often smoking with Lem Billings when he was visiting, which was frequently. With Bobby as his drug guru through the years of their curious relationship, Lem Billings would quickly graduate from marijuana. Following Bobby's lead, Billings, decades older and with heart problems, tripped on LSD, did angel dust, and shot speed, cocaine, and eventually heroin, all to show he was as youthful and hip as the young Kennedy he adored. For Bobby, the Brody household must have seemed like nirvana. Sex with his girlfriend was okay, smoking pot was okay, he just had to be at the table in time for dinner. Lem Billings, Brody immediately had gathered, was obsessively devoted to Bobby, loyal to him, and extremely dedicated to the Kennedy family. It was Billings who was basically in loco parentis, she noted. It was he, not Ethel, who handled all of Bobby's expenses, his $2,400 tuition at Palfrey, his rent at the Brodys, which Joey said was a couple $100 a month, mainly to cover Bobby's food bill. Lem was the one I contacted if anything happened with Bobby, said Brody, such as the time one of the rent checks bounced. He would come over fairly frequently for dinner whenever he was in town. He played with Bobby, if you will, more than a father probably would, was just devoted to him, and there was a really honest affection between them. They had a joking, warm relationship, and at least from my perspective, it was very positive. The Brodys were aware that Billings was gay, but it wasn't an issue with them that he and young Bobby had such a close and intimate relationship, mainly because the Brodys themselves had close homosexual friends. A number of them were in the political world, men who later became rather well-known politicians in the state of Massachusetts, she boasted, like Barney Frank and Jerry Studs. A Harvard graduate and a leading Democrat, Barney Frank, like Lem Billings, was closeted for many, many years, even, unlike Billings, dating women. But Barney Frank came out publicly in 1987 when the media began examining his personal life. Lem Billings never did. At that time, a reputed bisexual Republican congressman from Connecticut had died, and Frank was quoted in the Washington Post stating, "There was an unfortunate debate about was he or wasn't he? Did he or didn't he?" I said to myself, I don't want that to happen to me. He retired from Congress in 2013 and was succeeded by Bobby's nephew, Joseph P. Kennedy III, son of Bobby's brother Joe. The first openly gay member of Congress, Jerry Studs, was censured in 1983 by the House of Representatives for having a sexual relationship with a 17-year-old male congressional page, an affair that Studs claimed was consensual. The Page scandal rocked Washington, and Studs was stripped of a powerful subcommittee chairmanship. He left Congress in 1997 and married his longtime lover in 2004, shortly after same-sex marriage became legal in Massachusetts. He died in 2006. Because I had plenty of gay friends, and I think there's a kind of gaydar, I sensed that Lem was gay. But he was pretty buttoned down and communicated himself as being Ivy League preppy, Joey Brody remembered. He had a kind of gentleness and sensitivity that was not the kind of way the typical straight guy of his age would behave. I never said to anyone, "Do you think Lem's gay?" It never came into our heads because we didn't care. I didn't dwell on it, and I trusted Lem to really have Bobby's best interests at heart. While Kim Kelly was under the impression that Bobby was her steady, he had quickly developed a close relationship with an exotic-looking kind of hippie, very sexy, very smart Armenian-American Palfrey Street Jr., a rebel like him by the name of Vicky. Along with using, Bobby was also said to have been selectively dealing and reportedly sold a hefty bag of marijuana to his drug-addled younger brother David, then at Middlesex, a boarding school in nearby Concord. When the pot was stolen, sources claimed that Bobby showed up at his brother's school playing the role of a tough drug dealer and reportedly tracked down the thief, frightening him so that he told all to the administration. David refused to finger his brother, the story goes, but Bobby was identified when a witness pointed to his picture in a magazine. As a result, David received a suspension. Bobby played the macho role to the hilt with his wild behavior, drug use, and braggadocio, which was underscored with new friends he was meeting and bringing into his circle, some of whom would remain loyal to him throughout his life. The glitz and glamour and power of the Kennedys would always be a draw for him, helping him lure in bright and talented people, just as his uncles and father had done, and he would use that Kennedy star power to his benefit. Andrew Karsh, for one, was a strapping all-state prep school quarterback studying at Brandeis when Bobby met him during his year at Palfrey. Immediately, Bobby tried to impress Karsh with his physicality and machismo. Strapping on climbing spurs, the kind he used to rescue his hawks, he scaled a tree to show Karsh his Tarzan-like agility. When he visited Karsh's home, he picked up a thick paperback book and bet Karsh that he could tear it in half, emulating those carnival strongmen who wowed the crowds by tearing the thick Manhattan Yellow Pages book in half. We made a bet, and then he started going at it, straining until he was purple in the face. He didn't tear it, but the book looked like it had been mangled by a wild animal, Karsh later recalled. During the Boston winter that Bobby was at Palfrey, Karsh joined him and his brother David in a Hyannisport Terriers-type pursuit, throwing snowballs at passing cars. One driver, whose automobile was hit, braked to a stop. A bruiser who had played college football, he came toward them yelling about our irresponsibility, Karsh recalled. That's when scrawny David Kennedy confronted the man and out of the blue punched him in the face. The rest of us were too petrified to run, Karsh remembered, but he observed that David had looked over at Bobby, the older brother whom he was always trying to impress, to see if he was proud of what he had done. Over the years, Bobby would surround himself with a circle of talented people who excelled, who were loyal to him, and who were excited to be in the Kennedy magic circle. One of them was Karsh, who went on to be an Academy Award-nominated producer, whose films include The Prince of Tides, Town and Country, and The Emperor's Club. Through his friendship with Bobby, Karsh had become part of the world of Kennedy politics, including Ted Kennedy's successful 1976 senatorial campaign, and in 1980, he served as media director when Kennedy ran for the presidency. Quote, "I loved his politics. I grew up with the Kennedy family. I just have tremendous respect for the whole family, and I really like them all." Moreover, Karsh had literally become part of the extended clan as Bobby's brother-in-law, married to the sister of his second wife, the ill-fated Mary Richardson Kennedy, who committed suicide in 2012. But all of that was far in the future. The fact that Bobby was from one of the most famous families in America made little, if any, impression on most of his Palfrey classmates, many of whom came from working-class backgrounds. "We weren't enamored of him," recalled a Palfrey graduate. "We didn't care that there was a Kennedy there. Palfrey people were eccentric, different, so most of us didn't even like him being there, to be honest, and he didn't seem to give a shit about any of us. Everybody at Palfrey Street School cared about that place, but Bobby Kennedy clearly didn't. None of it impressed him. Because we were all so full of love, we weren't going to call him an arrogant bastard, but some people did. As the school year rolled by, Joan Brody observed that there truly developed a level of trust between Bobby and her family. In fact, she had never told anyone outside of her immediate family his last name, and if anybody asked, it was always just Bobby. She tried to make his home life as different as possible from the one he had come up in Hickory Hill, where he had complained of being controlled and dominated and manipulated by his mother. Brody recalled how, before Bobby arrived, she had often read in the press and magazines upbeat, respectful stories that portrayed Hickory Hill as a happy family place, always so much fun and so loving. But it really wasn't, she observed years later. I never bought it, and I never thought it. She and her husband, however, did have one visit to Bobby's fabled homestead. Because they had cared for Bobby during his year at Palfrey, the Brodys were invited by Lem Billings to attend his 60th birthday celebration in April 1976, America's bicentennial year. As Brody stated with a chuckle, who could resist that invitation? Despite the close connection she had with Bobby, her first and only meeting with his mother consisted of little more than a brief handshake. Brody never forgot how Ethel treated her. I was in her home and never even had a conversation with her. She acted like a jerk to me. Many years later, Joey Brody watched the 2012 HBO documentary film Ethel, directed by the matriarch's youngest child, Rory. Talk about sanitized, she said while watching it. It was like sugar, but that's okay because somebody has to tell the good side of Ethel. In the spring of 1972, with graduation from high school finally looming, 18-year-old Bobby planned to take the SAT college board exam. His goal was acceptance at Harvard, which was virtually guaranteed, SATs or no SATs. So many Kennedys before him had gone there. His grandfather, the Klan's patriarch, Bobby's own father, his iconic uncle, the president, his other uncle, the esteemed senator from Massachusetts. The prestigious Kennedy name practically ruled the institution. Looming over Cambridge was the John F. Kennedy School of Government. Even his very troubled brother, David, would be admitted. If anyone was preordained to get into America's most prestigious Ivy League academy, it was Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Despite his addictive drug use, his erratic and often bizarre behavior, his run-ins with law enforcement, and what were said to be mediocre grades, and little, if any, extraordinary extracurricular activities. To Bobby, the test must have seemed merely a meaningless exercise. Still, he was jumpy about taking it. There came a day when Bobby and his classmates were asked to fill out applications for the college or colleges of their choice. Bobby, of course, chose only one, and that was Harvard, which he considered his birthright. It should be noted that when his uncle Jack applied to Harvard on April 23, 1935, he wrote just 5 brief sentences, stating that he felt Harvard would give him a better background and a better liberal education than other schools, and he closed by writing, "Then, too, I would like to go to the same college as my father. To be a Harvard man is an enviable distinction, and one that I sincerely hope I shall attain." But Bobby Jr.'s Harvard application was far different from his uncle's, at least according to Palfrey classmates who claimed that he simply wrote his name, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., at the top, sent it in, and got accepted. When Joey Brody heard that story years later, she said that if it was true, it was, quote, disgusting. It just reeks of arrogance. But I did not experience Bobby as arrogant. In June 1972, Bobby Kennedy Jr. finally graduated high school, 7 months before turning 19. He had spent 4 troubled years at 3 different schools, and once had to repeat his sophomore year. For Bobby and those who taught him, it was a difficult time, beginning just literally weeks after his father was gunned down, and continuing during the escalation of his drug use and other behavioral and emotional problems. After Bobby graduated and went off to Harvard, his relationship with one of many childhood sweethearts, a girl named Vicky, who still had another year at Palfrey, abruptly ended. He probably looked at me as somebody who was fun and who was pretty and who was smart, but that's about it, she told this author. However, more than a decade later, Vicky, who had become a successful Boston-area pastry chef and restaurateur, was sitting with a male friend at the bar in a popular restaurant in Cambridge's Harvard Square when she heard a voice from the distant past say, "Hi, Vicky." She turned around, and it was Bobby Kennedy Jr., whom she hadn't seen since he left Palfrey. She had had no other contact with him. He said, "You've been living in Vermont, and I hear you've been cooking." For some reason, he knew all this stuff about me, and it went through my head, how the hell does he know all these things? It was true. I'd lived in Vermont. I'd been to India. I'd gone halfway around the world. I thought that because of his powerful family, he had powers to find out things about me, and I wondered, why did he even care? Because Bobby had spoken so highly of the Brody family and the home's liberal atmosphere, his cousin Christopher Lawford subsequently roomed with them for about a year while he was a student at nearby Tufts University. For both of us, they were the warm, nurturing family that neither of us seemed to have, but we were looking for, Lawford later observed. In Hollywood, when Lawford visited his actor father, the two had bonded by getting stoned on marijuana. His apartment was, quote, a treasure chest of illicit substances. Bobby had also enjoyed his swinging uncle, Peter Lawford's company. Idolized by the young Kennedys, Lawford had been a member of the Hollywood Rat Pack, which included the womanizing, hard-drinking Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Dean Martin, the comedian Joey Bishop, and Warren Beatty's movie star sister, Shirley MacLaine, who later wrote about her encounters with UFOs and other unworldly beings. According to Patricia Seton Lawford, Lawford's fourth, much younger wife, whom he had married not long before his death, Bobby arrived on their apartment doorstep after one of the many times his mother had thrown him out of Hickory Hill. And, the good uncle that he was, Peter Lawford shared his pot stash with Bobby and escorted him to his friend Hugh Hefner's Playboy mansion, where they presumably enjoyed the pleasures of the bunnies who inhabited the place. Before I read this next part of the chapter, I should probably give an explicit warning, a parental warning if you have little ones in the room. Might want to shoo them off before we get into this story. It's only for adults. Years later, Patricia Lawford, who remarried after Lawford's death, recalled a shocking scene she claimed happened as she and Bobby chatted in the living room during one of his visits. While Peter Lawford was in the bathroom showering, Bobby leaned close to her and said, "I wish you weren't married to my uncle. I'd fuck you right here on the couch." Bobby wasn't the only Kennedy who had come on to her. She recalled that in June 1980, Peter Lawford had asked her to call his ex-brother-in-law, Ted Kennedy, as a favor. And when the senator got on the phone, he said, "I hear you're the one with the big tits. The kids all told me." He then asked her when she planned to come east and campaign for him, and said that when she did so, he'd take her on a skiing date. She stopped him cold by telling the powerful U.S. Senator, "I'm married to Peter." In his later years, Peter Lawford fell on hard times. To bring in income, he had turned to leaking stories about the Kennedys and other Hollywood celebrities to the National Enquirer, a long-held secret revealed in an unpublished memoir by a veteran of the supermarket tabloid, Tony Brenna. In his book, Anything for a Headline, Brenna wrote, quote, "We had a symbiotic relationship that was unique in my career. He needed the cash offered for his cooperation, and my standing at the National Enquirer soared when I wrote stories based on his insider information. As the former husband of Pat Kennedy, Peter provided an intimate look at the triumphs and tragedies of the Kennedys' extended clan." Years later, after Peter's son, Christopher Lawford, had gotten sober through many rehab stays, he asserted, quote, I loved getting high. I took anything and everything. Drugs were my Wheaties, my breakfast of champions. I used drugs for 17 years. His primary purpose in life, he revealed in his stark 2006 memoir, Symptoms of Withdrawal, was to be high every day from the age of 13 until he reached the age of 30. And he observed, I may have been in the second tier of the Kennedy family, but as far as the world was concerned, I was a Kennedy. Being a Kennedy meant I could get away with a lot of shit. The last time Joey Brody saw Bobby Jr. was in September 1989, when her husband, out jogging, suddenly collapsed and died at 57, and Bobby came to the house to pay his respects. Bobby had heard about John Brody's death from his brother Joe, then a congressman, in whose office Brody's son was working. After Brody's death, the Cambridge intersection where their home was located was renamed John Brody Square. Naturally, Joey Brody had followed Bobby's life through the years. She was aware of his first failed marriage, his drug problems that had gotten worse, his second marriage and that wife's suicide, and more. He must have had a terrible time forming deep and trusting relationships, Brody observed. I'm glad he decided not to run for office, and I don't blame him. I'm sure he didn't want the exposure. I think he's a much stronger person than he was when he was in my house, and I have a great deal of respect for what he's been able to do in his life in overcoming many, many serious problems and difficulties. But you face your demons over and over in life. I think that's a good place to leave it, as certainly the Senate confirmation hearings for Bobby Kennedy Jr. Will bring that exposure she spoke of many of the things that are revealed in this book. I hope you enjoyed these chapters. Next week we'll be back, and we'll start with chapter 14. Until then, take care. I'm Laurie Spencer.